Well, good afternoon.
Good
Irina
afternoon.
Slav, our energy mining and geopolitics expert here from Bulgaria. How are
Hello.
you? Hey.
I'm fine,
Um,
thank you.
so, those are the topics that I really want to speak with Irina about today. Can you perhaps tell us a little bit about yourself to sort of confirm the authority of speaking on these topics?
All
Forgive me.
right. Yes, of course. Well, I've been writing about the oil industry for 6 or 7 years now. I started with Russia and Central Asian producers, and then when I moved to Oil Price.com, I'm covering the whole world. And it's not just oil. I've been writing about everything related to energy. So there's been a lot of renewables recently, and there are going to be more stories about this. But yes, oil, gas, and of course, as you said, the geopolitical aspect of the industry is what I do on a daily basis.
And in the process of writing these articles, are you leaning on first-hand experience, or are you just leaning on a lot of the information that is available to all of us that you can collect in public?
Oh, it's definitely the latter. I don't have any first-hand experience with the industry, so there's
Hmm.
been a lot of research to do through the years, and I've accumulated hopefully some knowledge, including some technical
Yes, of course.
knowledge. But I have yet to visit an offshore platform. This is on my bucket list.
Okay. Well, hopefully we can make it happen before the offshore rigs are completely redundant. Um,
Oh, now that you
but
mention it,
perhaps that's
here's a funny story. It's not really a funny story, but an interesting story I saw on the BBC recently that there is actually a chance that not all offshore platforms will need to be decommissioned and dismounted because they could make for great nurseries for various marine organisms, interestingly
oh,
enough.
okay. How about that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Something good can come out of it.
Yes. Um, but perhaps also that might teeter into the narrative of this. I wanted to see, because oil has such a bad rap and it's not all bad. So to say perhaps something good can come out of it. Well, I mean, they did also produce the oil in the first place, which can also be a good, but that's
And
like
it is.
that comes down to where you, yeah, precisely. I did read this in one of your articles, and I lent on it quite heavily in an interview I did recently with a man called Tom Raftery. But basically, you reported that BP claims that as much as 1.5 trillion barrels of oil are in reserve. And they estimated that this could last up to about 50 years or so if we didn't bring anything else out of the ground. So, take it with a grain of salt, either side, but even with a bit of variability, 50 years is a lot of time for oil reserves, especially when you look at the entire energy field and see all the different maneuvers that are coming towards the top, from renewables to maybe geothermal to maybe nuclear innovations and so forth. And so I wanted to hear your opinion on the following assertion that I make. If the world is shifting away from oil and gas and further towards renewables, and we have 50 years of oil reserves at hand, then isn't therefore the oil industry almost redundant at this stage and a threat to our response to climate change?
No, it's not. And actually, some argue that I'm sure you remember about 10 years ago, there was all this talk about peak oil supply. In that case, that oil was running out, it was going to run out soon, and what are we going to do about it? But in fact, some experts in the field, geologists, argue that there is no such thing as peak oil supply because extraction technology is improving constantly and they can reach deposits that were previously unreachable and reserves of oil that were previously unrecoverable. So we might well have oil for more than 50 years. As for the redundancy, no, because besides the fuels that are made from oil, there's a lot of other products that are being made from oil and from gas. And it's not just plastics, it's all sorts of things. There are oil derivatives in everyday stuff like toothbrushes and toothpastes and cosmetics products. The list is really long. And these are not things that we could live without. Oil companies are, in fact, right now considering a future in which they will be leaning almost exclusively on petrochemicals because so many different things are being made from oil that are not either not replaceable at all or not replaceable economically. We all want to be responsible, buy organic and stuff, but not all of us can afford it. I think sometimes in the climate change debate and the oil industry demise debate, we seem to forget that not the whole world has the standard of living that we enjoy in Europe and North America. So I'd say that oil and oil derivatives and everything that is made from oil will be around for more than 50 years.
Could you lean a little bit more on that comment you just made about how in countries around the world that have different standards of living to, say, what we have in Western Europe or the US, why that necessarily means that they will rely more heavily on oil products?
Well, because, for example, a toothbrush, the cheapest toothbrushes, at least in Bulgaria, and I think in the rest of Europe, are made from plastic. They're completely derived from oil. If you want a responsible, sustainable toothbrush, you will need to pay extra. And this is just one small, tiny example. In the larger picture, right now, Asian economies, developing economies, are the biggest drivers of oil demand globally. We're talking about India and China. And while you might argue that China is quite a wealthy country, India has yet to build its middle class to such an extent as to make us able to talk about a comparable standard of living. We're talking about millions and millions of people who simply cannot afford to be as environmentally responsible as Western Europeans and Americans.
And I suppose the natural extension of that point would then become, once the energies are cost efficient, so for example, it no longer becomes a environmental decision for me to, say, maybe drive an electric car, or on a much smaller, more micro level, say, use a wooden toothbrush, even though, to be frank, I've never used one myself. It's always been plastic, and it's the only thing you see.
I haven't either.
Yeah, but the way I'm thinking about it is just that rather than it being like an environmentally conscious decision to make, it can just be simple economics, the right decision to make. And then perhaps I'm going to get into this with you later a little bit as well, but how subsidies can sort of redirect the price incentive to where the individual consumer, you and I, and then the person in Vietnam and the Philippines as well, they are making simultaneously the environmental decision and the economic decision. And that's obviously the holy grail there. But I think you make a terrific point that oil is way more than just engines. It's a lot more than just this combustible material that you use to get around places. I mean, as you said, one of the biggest byproducts is plastic, and just it is the dominant sort of material that we interact with on the day to day. Do you have any insight into what percentage of oil that comes out of the ground is converted eventually into plastic? It's something
I really have no idea. I haven't made this research, but knowing the amount of plastic waste we produce on a daily basis from just single-use plastics, even if it's a small percentage, because yes, the bulk of a barrel of oil goes into petrol and diesel fuel and jet fuel. But it's still, even if as a percentage it's not a lot per barrel, it is a lot in terms of total quantities produced daily.
I think off the top of my head, I once read that 1 million single-use plastic bottles are consumed per minute around the world.
That's a really scary number.
Which
A scary number. Yeah.
it's an absurd number. I want to make sure I'm not getting it wrong. So it could be. It's definitely, there's far more than 1 million consumed per day, so it could be maybe an hour. But I think it was 1 million per minute. And I mean, anyone who's traveled to Asia or Latin America can see this firsthand. I mean, the majority of your consumables come out of a one-time plastic use. The huge problem, right? But I guess it's not really a problem. It's not oil's problem there. That's
It's
like,
not oil's problem. This
pollution
is
problem.
the problem
No,
of all of us who are
manufacturer's problem.
consuming this. Well, it's the same with fuel, really.
Yeah,
We consume the fuel. Nobody is forcing us.
What other, apart from plastic, what are other byproducts of oil that we're not so familiar with, casual people like myself?
Oh, well, for starters, when you say plastics, it's really an umbrella term. There's so many kinds of resins and additives. You know, there's even oil in pharmaceuticals, in pills. I can't go into much detail because I don't have the details, as in exactly what form does the oil in aspirin, for example, take. But there are traces of oil derivatives in drugs, in over-the-counter drugs, I mean. So, you know, when you say plastics, I guess most people, such as myself, imagine single-use plastics or water bottles or shopping bags. But there are so many different things that fall under this umbrella term of plastics. Car tires, paints as well.
Paints, wow. Yeah, okay.
Yes,
You know,
paints.
because it's
Consumer electronics, my laptop is made from plastic. So is yours. Not all of it, but, you know, the casing is made from plastic.
it's really such a good point to make that, and I know that I'm repeating myself now, but I do want to emphasize it, that when I've been thinking about oil and a transition towards renewable energies, the notion of, well, what are all the other things that we're relying on for oil doesn't actually get sort of priced in. It doesn't get taken account for. So it might be true that the oil exploration industry might continue to live on, even when we maybe have a majority electric energy for transportation, simply to fuel the demand for all these other things.
Yes, because electric cars also need oil for their plastic parts inside, for the paint. Yes, also wind turbines need oiling, and that oil is synthetic. It's made from crude oil. And now I've just thought of another example, synthetic fibers. Environmentally friendly people who want to protect nature, want to reduce their use of organic materials, they dress in synthetic fibers, which come from the oil industry.
Yeah.
We are surrounded by oil. It's not a pretty thought, I expect, but we are.
I suppose now we're sort of like leaning into what your worldview is. With all of the information you consume and all of the writing that you produce as well, how do you look out into the world now, thinking of the energy transition?
Okay, I'll try to not be completely candid with my opinions, because they are leaning on the extremely unpopular, but that's because I think because all this talk about climate change and climate crisis, it's gone a bit too far, I think. The world is not going to end in 10 years or in 50 years, because nature is smarter than us. Nature can take care of itself, and as we have seen with the pandemic, it knows how to, curb our destructive influence over it, which is it's inarguable. we have been having a devastating effect on nature, destroying ecosystems, including through oil drilling in sensitive parts of the world. And even if they're not so sensitive, we are destructive as a species, that's true. But I think right now the narrative has gone to extremes. I see these plans being made to spend billions upon billions. In fact, today the International Renewable Energy Agency released a report that said we need to spend $131 trillion between now and 2050 to hit the Paris Agreement targets. This is an insane amount of money, which they say should be put into building our solar and wind generation capacity and a massive buildup of hydrogen, green hydrogen capacity. It boggles the mind. And we seem to forget that solar installations, for example, take up a lot of land, which is usually arable land, and that could become a problem. They affect ecosystems as well. Wind, I think, is not as problematic because you can build the turbines offshore. And green hydrogen is so expensive right now. I really don't understand how all these planners are going to bring the cost down, because cost is the big problem of the energy transition. And this is not a topic that is being talked about a lot. We are hearing how solar costs are coming down, but these are the costs of the panels. This is not all you need. You need energy storage because the sun doesn't shine all the time. And even the wind, even offshore, the UK, sometimes dies down. There's such a thing as wind drought. So you need energy storage, and that means normally battery storage, which is expensive. So it's a lot more complex than the mainstream media, the general news media make it sound.
I love hearing, this sort of opinion, because it does run in contrast to, say, a conversation I had very recently with a wonderful guy called Tom Raftery, who was proposing not the antithesis to what you're saying, but nonetheless like rather contrary, talking about how, say, solar and wind renewables not only are going to be more efficient than oil, but also are going to cost less. And we already are seeing this in certain innovations around the world. I think, like you rightly say, the conversation is always two like utopian outlooks. One saying the renewables are going to perfectly solve everything, cost everything, planet's going to be back to normal. And then the other side saying, all of your efforts are futile. We're just going to have to keep relying on oil, and then like there has to be some sort of like to and fro in between. And I'm not suggesting that your argument is the latter, because it's certainly not, as you just said, but it is like more of a, I suppose, realistic approach, which is, yes. I wanted to comment on one thing you said there as well, because you said the world will, well, you didn't say this, but I'm paraphrasing, like the world will return to equilibrium. Nature will return us to equilibrium. And this is very true.
Of course, nature always wins.
But I think one of the point of that is that what will the cost be in a return to equilibrium? Because if we do continue to produce more and more carbon into the atmosphere, and it has the devastating natural consequences that some people are suggesting it's going to have, well then, sure, nature will be fine, but we won't be. And so then I guess it's like trying to figure out how can we return ourselves to equilibrium without nature doing it for us.
It's actually really simple to me, the solution, but it's not easy.
Okay.
All we need to do is simply consume less energy. Then we won't need to produce more oil and gas or build so much power generation capacity, even if it's renewable. But it is a lot easier said than done. It will
No,
include
sorry.
very, very unpopular measures. If it's
Yes.
possible at
Yes.
all, I don't think it's possible. I don't think you could
Mm.
force people to spend less energy.
It's not. It's possible to enforce it, but it is completely dangerous and not right to enforce it. And
It
therefore, I
won't
don't think
end
that would be the
well.
case. And if we look
Mm.
precisely, and if we look to developing economies, Asia, Latin America, Africa, these people want to consume more, and have every right to do so, and should do so, and you would encourage them to do so. And as you know, like looking at the geopolitical things side of things as well, is it's not just sort of more oil they want to consume. It's not just maybe having more cars per person or driving more kilometers per person. It's eating more meat per person. And then it's like, what are the consequences of the agricultural industry? Because they are easily, I think, after transport, the biggest emitter globally. When you have in the West the narrative saying we need to produce and consume far less meat, which is like great. I totally agree. It's a good argument, both for environmental and health reasons. But then you have in the developing nations saying, well, no, we want to eat a lot of meat now. And it's like, well, you have every right to do so. But they that conflict doesn't solve anything. It just stagnates in the middle as like it continues on forward.
Absolutely, because I think the trends of spending and energy consumption are all the same. When you take, for example, India and China, they're getting a bigger middle class. People are getting wealthier. So what do? Do they start consuming less energy and resources? No, they don't. They start consuming more, buying bigger cars, more cars, eating better, which is perfect. But it's not just about eating better. They are consuming more, and that's perfectly normal. This is how, this is what humans do when they get more, when they get richer, when they can afford to consume more. So you can't go to these people and tell them, look, we're killing the planet. How about you don't buy a second car, for example? They will say, I have every right to buy a second car because I can afford it and I want it and it will be more convenient to me. We like comfort, we like convenience, and this is costing us and it's costing the planet.
Because you're totally correct in at least I agree with you. Who's to say whether we're correct or not? But I do agree with you that the developing world will consume more energy, and rightly so, and fantastic. It's going to increase living standards. It's going to increase whatever the consequences of an increased living standard is, which is perhaps further prosperity, which might even fuel more innovation, which can like rise the entire tide of humanity. The better off everyone is, the better off we all are, kind of thing.
That's true.
And then and then you think about like, if that is true, if this is something that we cannot stop, what is then the right solution to this? So that's what I want to ask you. Like, do you see a way towards a more healthier climate that is in line with also growing energy demand?
I really can't, not at this point at least. To me, this sounds like having your cake and eating it. And I can't see a way this could happen right now. We'll either pursue this massive energy transition program, and if it pans out, our cost of living will increase significantly, and poverty will increase in parts of the world where it previously was not a big issue. At the same time, funnily enough, or not literally funny, Africa has this huge potential for renewable energy, but it can't put it to good use because it lacks things like transmission infrastructure. So you can put a solar panel on a house, and this is being done, which is great, but you can't build utility scale installations to supply a bigger part of the population of, say, Nigeria with renewable energy. The transition is fraught with problems that are not getting enough attention.
Okay.
And they should, because
What
if these problems get more attention, we have a better chance of solving them and doing it right.
What are these big problems that aren't getting attention that you see?
Well, for starters, all the other, like for example, infrastructure, storage is one big problem. There's a lot of talk about storage and new storage technologies that are cheaper, but still, all the experts who are being honest, they say that battery storage is not advanced enough. Like these huge batteries that Tesla is building in Australia, they can only store the equivalent of a couple of hours of supply for half a million households, which is great for a short outage. But what if the outage is longer? What do we do then? We have blackouts. Infrastructure in many parts of the world who would benefit the most from renewable energy, which is cheaper, coming free from the sun and the wind. But the transmission network that is necessary to take this energy from the solar farm to the village or town is not cheap. That's a lot of money. And then, as I recently wrote about Africa, that's why I'm giving it as an example. One energy industry source told me that investors are not interested because people in Africa can hardly afford to pay for a regular energy supply from a solar farm or a wind farm. So it's not as cheap as it's purported to be, not globally. It's cheaper somewhere, but in other places it's not that cheap. So yeah, cost,
So if we
energy storage, which is reliability and cost are the two biggest challenges from what I've been following, and they're really big problems.
if we take that example as one of the big challenges to transitioning towards a more healthy energy climate, environmentally healthy, if infrastructure is one of the biggest speed bumps, it seems to me that that's kind of a big detail, but not actually but not actually the problem itself. Because if we've solved, say, for example, solar and wind and battery potential in a few generations forward, does actually have the like per unit energy capacity to power entire economies, then that infrastructure project, that just becomes more infrastructure projects. You know what I'm like? I'm not asking this question very well, but basically I'm saying it seems to me that we have the solution. If all it takes is better infrastructure to get to the implementation of it, that seems like a rather small roadblock, because what else are governments going to be spending the money on if not domestic infrastructure projects? And it seems to me like this would be a great source of foreign investment for lots of big private energy companies as well. Is the infrastructure side of things much harder to solve than I am suggesting?
Yes. In fact, the problem in Africa is the smaller problem. The grid problem is bigger in Europe and the United States, because governments are planning near complete electrification. This means electrification of transport, and that's a big change to what the electric grid is being used for now. And there are a lot of warnings being sounded that the grid, the European grid, the North American grid, needs to be prepared for this transition before all the millions of electric cars begin rolling out of factories. I'm not an expert on electricity, so you know I can't give you technicalities. But from what I understand, the addition of several million electric cars will add a lot of load, a lot of demand on the grid. And if
Okay.
more of the electricity that is coming onto the grid comes from solar and wind, then we really need to make sure they are reliable and they have storage, because
Sure.
it will
Yeah.
change the whole, peak and trough pattern of demand, and the pressure on the grid to supply electricity everywhere where it's needed. So yeah, that's a pretty serious problem, and again, a costly one.
Hmm.
It's much easier to just build a transmission network from scratch in Africa.
I definitely don't want to be flippant about how easy the infrastructure might be to solve, but I just also want to try and provide an optimistic roadmap to where to find a middle between the people that say oil is the only future and the people that say renewables is the only future. I want to try and find something between that. But I think maybe since we're talking about Africa, it might be an interesting comparison to make in Nigeria, a country which you wrote an entire profile on. They have a thriving oil industry. Could you compare their oil industry and say the modes of production there and the outcome against, say, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is a giant renewable energy project in itself? Could you maybe compare the
I
energy
don't know
output that
much
they...
about it. I don't know
Oh,
much
okay.
about it.
Okay. It's a giant dam on the border of Ethiopia and Sudan, I think. It's like 6.5 gigawatt hydroelectricity, a giant producer of energy, essentially.
Right, I understand. Well, yes, I could make a comparison between total reliance on oil and reliance on a more diversified energy mix. Nigeria is notorious as one of the victims of the so-called oil curse, because because of its oil wealth, it relies on export revenues overwhelmingly from oil. Life for the people who live in the Niger Delta, where most of the oil fields are, is not great. I'm sure you know it's rife with pipeline leaks, because people cut into the pipelines to steal oil and refine it and then sell it to their neighbors. So oil is not great for a country's economic stability, if you like. And Nigeria has the potential, I'm sure, to build some pretty big solar installations. I don't know about its hydropower potential, but it sure must have some. But it will take oil money to do this, just like Saudi Arabia. They are planning to use their oil money, and using it already, to build solar farms, wind farms, hydrogen production plants. So again, oil money is being used to finance a move away from oil, which is actually pretty decent. It makes sense and is good. But
Makes sense,
again,
yeah.
yes, but to do it, you need the money. To get the money, you need people to consume oil, to continue consuming oil, so you get good enough prices to sell it at.
Mm,
So it's a
mm.
kind of a vicious circle right now.
True. Interesting paradox.
Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned people tapping into the oil illegally. Same thing happened in Mexico horrifically a few years ago. You saw it blew up and a lot
Yes.
of people perished. It kind of leads into, I think, the geopolitical line of questioning that I really have for you, which is my favorite of the three topics, my favorite. And I wanted to see what your sort of I wanted to ask you this. How does the drive towards more cost-efficient renewables affect geopolitics? So obviously you gave the example of Nigeria with the oil curse. Venezuela has famously, terribly, the oil curse. Saudi Arabia similarly. How do you see geopolitics being majorly affected by transition towards renewable energies?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind would be that OPEC and all its members could lose part of their international clout when oil stops being so essential. It will be a while before it happens, but this will be one major geopolitical shift because Saudi Arabia has been allowed to do pretty much whatever it wants regionally because it is a huge exporter of crude oil, and nobody wanted, for decades and decades, nobody wanted to have a problem with the Saudis because they would turn the taps off and leave Europe and the US without oil. This is one of the great things about renewables, by the way, that for now at least, you can build them on your own territory and, become more self-sufficient in energy, which is really important for any country. It's a matter
That's
of
a really
time,
good
I guess.
point, actually.
Yes. Before space runs out and we'll need to import and export energy again. But yes, the renewables you build, solar farms and wind farms you build off your own shore give you more self-sufficiency in energy. So that's one big consequence of the energy transition I can see for geopolitics. And yes, the bigger producers of solar and wind energy will possibly become more important geopolitically, have a greater say. Although right now I can't think of an example because the biggest producers, well, look at China, for example. It's got the most solar and wind capacity, but it's also got a lot of other capacity, mostly producing goods for export. So it's pretty important geopolitically. But this may change if a smaller country with a great solar potential emerges as a major exporter at some point decades in the future. So we could see some shifting over the long term as we rely less on fossil fuels and on the countries that extract them.
It seems like, just as you were speaking, it made me think that it seems like one of the biggest roadblocks for the renewable energy becoming universally adopted. We've gone through the infrastructure, but it's also the reliability through trough periods. You mentioned blackouts before, and I know that in, say, Austin recently, they had this problem, and in Australia we've had it before, and it is kind of one of the trump cards that the pro-oil side of the argument will throw at you. It's like, oil's reliable, renewables aren't. Do you see any solutions to the trough periods? Does it come down to just having great storage, great battery storage? I'm just trying to think, because you make the point that the great thing about renewables is that each country can become energy self-sufficient more or less, but certainly more so than they are now, and that's terrific for geopolitics. It completely
Absolutely,
reshapes the world.
that's very good for geopolitics.
Yeah.
Well, the alternative to building enough storage to ensure constant supply would be to somehow teach people when to consume energy, which I don't think is a very realistic option. Or maybe somehow combine. By the way, there are many different kinds of energy storage that are being researched right now. So maybe we won't have to rely on batteries all the time, or at least not on these lithium-ion batteries that are now dominant. So I'm sure we will see a lot of progress from that segment of energy research. I don't know when these alternatives will become viable. There was an idea to use electric cars as mobile batteries, and when there's a peak in demand, they could be linked to the plugged in into the grid so they can release electricity. But I don't think that's very smart from the perspective of these cars' lifespans. You know, the more charge recharge cycles, the shorter the life. So yeah, we need to work in this direction to find alternatives to battery storage that could make renewables more reliable. It's the intermittent part that's the problem.
Do you have any insights into the way oil versus renewables are being subsidized in Europe? I say Europe specifically just because that's both where we are. Perhaps you have a better insight into another major economic region. But I'd just love to hear what you think about that, because I know there is obviously quite a lot happening on both sides, but I just would like to hear what you think about that.
I know the European Union is subsidizing renewable projects strongly and electric cars. I think recently, where was it? I think France, they're offering EVs for free. But I'm sure the UK still subsidizes its oil and gas industry. I'm just not sure how much. I mean, I can't give you numbers. I know there's still subsidies for the oil and gas industry in the United States, but I think Europe is moving away from that. Those parts of Europe that still produce oil.
I really like the way that a guy called Bjorn Lomborg talks about this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's been making quite a bit of noise just because it's like an anti climate change response argument. But anyway, the reason why they committed 40 billion euros to it was to meet the the standards of the Paris Accords, which was to lower the temperature by X amount. And anyway, Bjorn figured out that Germany alone might be able to lower the temperature by a completely marginal amount, which essentially renders the money kind of useless apart from its signaling value to show that at least someone is trying to do something about this. And like that's I think, because I think the way to kind of think about it, if we're coming towards the end of the chat, obviously it's a very difficult subject to solve, but at the end of the day, it kind of always has to come back down to the price incentive, because we can't subsidize a shift of renewables without just destroying the economy, essentially. It has to come through the innovation that brings the price per unit of energy down below oil, and then oil can just exist for all of its byproducts as well. Just that came to mind thinking of what Europe might be subsidizing.
Yes, and you made a brilliant point there. There's a lot of signaling, but I fear not enough thinking. There's a lot of talk about billions here and billions there, but I've read some of the EU's Green New Deal documents. There is precious little detail on exactly where, for example, they're going to build all those green hydrogen installations, because you can't just build them anywhere. They need special conditions. The same is true for solar farms. You can't just build it anywhere, and wind turbines. It's the same with oil wells. You can't just drill anywhere. You need special geology. So in this, they're similar. And I think that there really is more talk than action, and we need more action and a little less talking and beating ourselves on how many billions we will invest in this or that. And when I say we, I mean humankind.
Given all you write about, read about, and think about the world, what country are you most bullish on looking into the future?
That's a great question. Huh. It depends on how long a future you mean.
Okay. Let's say
Let's just say that right now, I like the fact
our
that I live in
lifetime.
Bulgaria and not the UK, for example. 20 years from now, I don't know. I think I would like a country who has not gone all in on renewables, but has still retained some diversification with fossil fuels, even if there are lots. I would like a country where it wouldn't take half my monthly income to pay for electricity, basically. It's a sensitive topic down here because we do pay a lot of electricity, even if we have some of the lowest rates in Europe. But that's because we have a lower standard of living overall and lower income. And from what I've been seeing, the more you rely on renewables in Europe, for example, in Germany, electricity bills have been rising. So the cost of renewable energy generation may have been falling, but with the help of subsidies, and the cost is ultimately being passed on to the end consumer, which is not nice. Let's put it like this. Which is why energy diversification matters. Which is why natural gas is being hailed as the bridge fuel, and it's much cleaner than oil. Anyway, nobody in Europe uses oil for power generation. So that's, it's a moot point. And we didn't mention nuclear, but a growing number of people are warning, including the International Energy Agency, is warning that the energy transition simply won't work. It can't work without nuclear energy.
But what about a country? One single country. So you say maybe
Just
Bulgaria better
one
than the
single
United Kingdom.
country.
But across the entire world, what's a country that you look at and you think they've got a terrific future ahead of them?
I can't answer this question as simply as you'd like me to, because I'm thinking about the countries I like. For example, Denmark. I really like Denmark. But I don't know Denmark is a really environmentally friendly and a very happy place. I would love to live there, or at least spend time there. So yeah, maybe Denmark or Italy, but this is because I like these countries.
Sure. Okay.
I like them regardless of their carbon footprint.
Right. Or where their certain industries are going, what their geopolitics are suggesting they might be going towards and stuff like that. You just like Italy. Just one last question for you before I let you go. This is kind of like a baseline that I like to ask everyone. So if you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, who would they be?
It's a great question. Living or dead? Let me think. Does it have to be a possible conversation, or could I have, for example, Napoleon and Vladimir Putin?
You can have that.
Actually, that's what that sounds like fun. Yes, Napoleon and Putin.
Yeah,
don't ask me why.
That'd be a terrific one. It's funny how often Napoleon's mentioned.
Maybe because when you say in history he's a really notorious historical figure. Maybe the mind just thinks about. No, my first idea was about Catherine the Great because I have a weak spot for her. I really admire her, but I couldn't think of a suitable partner.
Who should we talk with? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, it's a great answer. And also, thank you for giving me so much time, and thanks for
Thanks for
sharing your worldview. Yeah,
Sure.
well, thank you very much, Irina. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's been great.